they do. So I just want to again give a hearty welcome. My name is Reverend Ty Holmes. I am from the One Spirit Interfaith Seminary graduating class of 2013, and I am delighted to be one of your hosts this evening. And I wanted to welcome you and let you know that the One Spirit Learning Alliance, which is our Uber host for the evening, the One Spirit Learning Alliance was founded in 2001. And their mission is to offer experiential interfaith and interspiritual education and professional training to support personal transformation and to prepare future spiritual leaders. This includes a 2-year interfaith seminary program, an interspiritual counseling program, and so much more. In fact, to give us a feel for the more, Lynn, I'm going to ask if you could pull up that little video.
We are one spirit. We open our hearts and our arms to all.
You will find us in hospitals, consoling parents late into the night.
Bringing hope into prisons and inspiring new life.
In corporations and government.
Leading in new ways.
Keeping ethics in the conversation.
We walk for peace.
For justice.
To end homelessness and hunger.
We care for the earth and for all living beings.
Some of us stand in the pulpit and look like ministers.
Most of us don't.
We are doctors,
lawyers, teachers,
activists,
healers,
parents,
business people,
techies,
and artists.
We are scientists and mystics.
We are Buddhist,
Christian, Hindu,
Jewish, Muslim,
Native American,
Yoruba,
Sikh,
and none of the above.
We work throughout the United States and all over the world in 6 continents.
What we have in common is our vow to serve
everyone.
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 With wisdom and compassion.
We are one. We are spirit.
We are one spirit.
So the One Spirit Learning Alliance is an amazing community, and One Spirit in Action is the service arm, the service and activism arm of the One Spirit Learning Alliance. Founded in 2013 by myself and fellow members of my graduating class, our mission is a dedicated and persistent practice of sacred service that's grounded in the unifying power, or I'd say the love or soul force, if you will, of the great wisdom traditions. And we have been very busy for the past 7 years. One Spirit in Action has organized drives for victims of domestic violence, homelessness, residents of Flint, Michigan, Syrian refugees. We've partnered with United Nations NGOs on work ranging from spirituality and global concerns to the International Peace Day. We've marched in the climate and women's marches. We've the March for Our Lives and NYC Pride. We've led peace notes campaigns, and we've rolled up our sleeves to do physical work in a Sandy rebuilding project. Most recently, One Spirit in Action has hosted and facilitated a series of consciousness-changing conversations on religion and violence, Islamophobia, racism, and tools for conscious communication. And we've done all this through our Building Bridges projects. We have created and facilitated groundbreaking workshops like the ones entitled The Work of Sacred Activism, and we've delivered these not only for the One Spirit community, but for other spiritual communities as well. Now, to paraphrase King, it's one thing to march with the oppressed, but it is the edifice that produces oppression that needs restructuring. And recently, our focus has been on dismantling white supremacy, which is the edifice upon which this nation is built. The grip of white supremacy is strengthened by many fingers. And this year, we're focusing on the destructive enterprise of mass incarceration. Our first event, which took place on February 20th, was a viewing of Ava DuVernay's groundbreaking film, 13th. Again, this took place on February 20th, and it was followed by a powerful and inspirational discussion. Tonight is our second event in the series, entitled With Freedom and Justice for All. And we are so lucky to have three amazing activists with us who are doing this much needed sacred work out in the world. I will introduce our first two presenters, and at the conclusion of their talk, I'll introduce our third and final speaker. But first, a few logistical items. We've already asked all of our attendees to mute, and I know Lynn has taken the lead in muting everyone. So please just make sure that you remain muted. Our hope is to open things up for questions at about 8:10 tonight. That's a little fluid, that is our hope. To help with this effort, as questions arise in your minds and your hearts, we'll ask you to please put those questions in the chat. Let me restate, the chat tonight is reserved for questions, not comments. You may be inspired, you may be compelled to shout amen at something that's said from the rooftops. We're gonna ask you to hold that back and leave the chat for questions. Our hope again is to leave time for our guest speakers to answer some of these questions starting at around 8:10, right? So again, please write your questions in the chat. And at 8:10, my team will begin to facilitate the question portion towards the end. And again, is a senior policy associate for the Osborne Center for Justice Across Generations, a graduate of Iona College and Benjamin Cardozo School. I am getting messages that I'm frozen. Can everyone still hear me? Yes, excellent. So as long as you can hear me, that's all you need. So again, a graduate of Iona College and the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. Wendell spent 14 years working for the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, working on affordable housing development throughout the city. Before going to law school, he was a legislative aide for a U.S. congressman in Washington, D.C. He joined the Osborne Association in 2019, where he works on parole and housing issues, elder reentry, and monitoring the New York City Board of Corrections oversight of city jails, including the much-needed closing of Rikers Island. His co-presenter tonight, Judith Rivera, is a program assistant at Osborne Association for the Workforce Development Department. Judith was directly impacted by mass incarceration. Her father served 36 years in prison. Regardless of this fact, she was a first-generation graduate in her family. In 2003, she received her degree in liberal arts from the Hudson County Community College. 2006, she received a BA in criminal justice at Keene University. In 2013, an MBA at Keller Graduate, as she and her children have been directly affected by mass imprisonment. So I want to welcome Wendell and Judith. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. We are excited to sit at your feet and learn. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, my name is Wendell Walters. I'm a senior policy associate at the Osborne Association. I work in the area of our organization called Justice Across, Osborne Center for Justice Across Generations. As was mentioned, I'm joined by my colleague, Judith Rivera, who works in our workforce development area also at the Osborne Association. We call her Zudi for short. Such a cute name that we love so much. First, I wanted to say that we're so grateful for the opportunity to be part of this dialogue. I mean, your introduction really got me thinking about the wide-ranging set of issues that you guys are we're trying to tackle. And certainly the issue of mass incarceration in this country is one that is significant in nature and has wide-ranging effects throughout our country. I mean, I don't have to tell folks, I'm sure they, and you guys already know, that the United States incarcerates so many more people in this country than the rest of the world does. I mean, I think our population as part of the world is less than 10%, but we incarcerate more than 20% of the worldwide population of those incarcerated. So yes, this is a significant issue that needs attention. I've come stocked with the PowerPoint that I'm going to try to challenge myself with sharing my screen so you guys can see it. There we go.
Yes.
Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Took a while for me to figure that out. So yeah, so we just simply entitled our presentation, "The Impact of Mass Imprisonment in America." Such a broad issue, and there's so many different angles to tackle. Osborne does play a significant role in this dialogue. We are primarily a service organization. We serve upwards towards, go to the next slide here, there we go. We serve upwards towards 10,000, I think it's even 12,000 clients per year in a variety of ways. We've been around for a long time. We incorporated in 1933 and named for the founder of our group, Thomas Mott Osborne. He was actually a former prison warden. Osborne works at every stage of the justice system, from arrest through reentry, seeking to reduce reliance on incarceration and increase public health and safety. We have offices throughout the state, primarily in New York City, the New York City surrounding area, with our offices, our headquarters, I should say, in the Bronx on Westchester Avenue. Our Brooklyn office, our Harlem office, a Newburgh office, and a recently opened Buffalo office. Excuse me. We also work in New York City jails, primarily in Rikers, of course, and in 27, state prisons. As I mentioned, I work, along with my small but mighty team, in the Osborne Center for Justice Across Generations, where we are dedicated to building, as it says here, a justice system that promotes healing, safety, accountability, and well-being across generations. Most of our work, all of our work, really focuses on, like our title of our group describes, justice across generations, working with the children and families of those incarcerated, and for those who are behind bars, who have significantly aged inside, and deal with the many, many obstacles when they return after being away for so long. Therefore, we value the dignity and worth of every individual and recognize that effective solutions lie in strengthening and partnering with communities. A big part of our work at what we call OCJAG is obviously the advocacy work. And we build campaigns along these issues and often hike ourselves up to Albany each year during legislative session. I'm there and my colleagues are there quite often. It's a slog up there, and we have had some successes most recently, actually, in some significant areas, and particularly around the area of bail reform, where most, if not all, misdemeanors no longer require bail, and some felonies as well. There was some rollback of that as everybody got all excited about what that could mean, but the historic nature of those changes is still pretty significant. They didn't reach too far into the bag, though, of the many requests and issues that the advocacy world tried to get passed into law, namely the stopping of solitary confinement and the release of what we call elders who have been away for so long and pose no threat to public safety and are expensive to house. But there was one success, and that was what we call the proximity bill. I may have heard of that. After a almost 10-year struggle, this bill was recently passed in the legislature in Albany a month or so ago. What is the proximity bill? Well, as part of OCJAG, again, we advocate for children and families of the incarcerated. And many times, the folks who are sent away from home and community are sent so far away. This is obviously a map of the state of New York, and you can see all the different security facilities throughout the state, and they're dispersed all throughout the north and western part of the state, and some in the southern Hudson Valley region, a couple prominent ones, Fishkill and Sing Sing, and the Bedford Hills facility and Taconic facilities that house the women. But you can imagine the disconnect that families have to endure when their loved ones are sent so far away, particularly for the children of the incarcerated. So the proximity bill was an effort to require that the state, through the corrections department, house the incarcerated at their option to be placed as close as possible to where their children are. It did take a while. There was some pushback by the corrections department over the years, but we finally were able to have that passed, and the success of the bill nearly becoming law. Because as we all know, getting through legislature is just one step, but we also and ultimately have to have the sign off and consent of the governor of New York. So that's a big part of our efforts right now, is to get the governor to see the light and to sign off on this bill. Children and families. The continuity of those relationships are very important to survival, to maintain one's sanity, really, when you're away for so long. My colleague, Judith Rivera, has that kind of experience. And she has written this beautiful poem that I'd love for her to recite to you guys right now. Judith, are you ready?
Thank you. Thank you, Wendell. Thank you, everybody. 68144. Incarceration is the separation and isolation of families, which leads to the humiliation and defamation of their characterization. I'm not the one who is punished, but your assassination against my dignity when I go through the detector makes me feel lesser. All because I have a loved one behind bars. You take this too far. Check my background, check my pockets. Am I dressed right? Did I violate your code of ethics? This is just your method to make sure we all see what prison life really means. Go, tell one, tell all, how the incarcerated affects us all. We the people are not at all equal, as you all recall. Separation and segregation, we're not united in this nation. I visited my dad, couldn't sit on his lap. CO gave my dad a tap. That's enough of that. 4 years old and I will never see my dad be there for me. I was an orphan just like Annie, hard knock life for us. I used to ride the Joint Connection bus from Newark to Trenton, New Jersey, state prison to see my daddy. 68144, Rafael Luciano, I'm his daughter. forever grateful, never shameful. My maker, my strength comes from he. I am him and he is me. Society can't make me hate you. These laws are made to break you and me apart, all because our skin is tan and dark. But I won't let them make me think less of you, Daddy. Forever and ever, you are my father. I will cherish you like no other. They took you away from me to make me struggle, to make our legacy buckle. As long as I'm conscious, I will speak of all the injustice done to thee. It's not right. It's not fair. I'm 40 and you're still in there? As long as I live, I will always be Daddy's little girl to my daddy. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zudi. That always gets me. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
My pleasure.
We celebrate children of the incarcerated. We have a campaign called CS Support Us that does celebrate these families through event and advocacy, so folks don't forget the children and the families who've been away for so long. Osborne heads the New York Initiative for Children of the Incarcerated, and they partner with many like-minded groups to see change, to see reform, so those who are away are not forgotten, and neither are their families. See hashtag CS Support Us and the website that I could put in the chat later on in the presentation. Words matter. Words matter for children. I'm the victim of this myself, and I'm sure many others. Think about how a child may feel when words like offender and felon are used when speaking about their parent. Instead of felons or ex-cons, our community says formerly incarcerated person, returning person, people with prior criminal justice involvement. Instead of inmates or offenders, say parent, because they are parents. People who are incarcerated. Use language that recognizes the humanity of incarcerated people. Justice across generations. There are also people who have been away for many, many years. Older people make up now over 20% of the New York State prison population. Older people are the fastest growing demographic in prison. By 2030, 1/3 of all incarcerated people will be on advanced stage, representing a 4,400% increase over the next 50 years. This is largely due to the harsh sentencing laws of a generation ago. People were very young adults, made serious mistakes, and are languishing in prison for many, many decades. Here's a somewhat dated chart, but does tell a story. The blue line, the dashed blue line, just shows the percentage increase of the US population that's over 55 years old. The dotted brown line shows the US population, the growth percentage of the US population, US prison population since 1990. The obvious issue there is that red line. The prisoners 55 years of age and older, and the percentage growth from 1990. Close to 800% increase. They're languishing. In New York State, there's close to 10,000 seniors or elders who are 55 years of age and older. Yes, they're staying there, and they're, as the incarceration rate decreases, their percentage of that incarceration rate increases, but they're still coming home, and they're coming home in droves. Close to over 1,000, I should say, of individuals who are 50 years of age and older are returning to New York City each year, and they're coming home with enormous needs. Half of them are coming and going home to the shelter system in New York City, which you all know is exhausted, and has many problems, I should just say. This population has, of course, unique needs. They're expensive to house. $16 billion annually, it's estimated that it costs government to incarcerate those of 50 years of age and older. Those costs are significantly higher than incarcerating somebody who's less than that age. In New York, it's estimated close to 100,000 to 240,000 per individual per year for folks who are of advanced age. It's expensive. These folks pose no risk to society, no risk to public safety. They've aged out of crime. These are the recidivism rates for this group of people. On the left, you have the recidivism rates in New York State for all people of all ages. So you see in the green, you see the 34% recidivism rate for all ages. Now, I should point out that also includes parole violations, which is another story altogether. People are being incarcerated just for violating parole. It's a 34% recidivism rate. But for folks who are 65 years of age and older, the recidivism rate is a mere 9%. That includes parole violations. For new commitments for doing new crimes, it's a mere 1%. They're expensive and low risk. In response to this, Osborne created one of the most unique programs called the Elder Reentry Initiative. These folks are coming home. This program was developed as a model through the Aging Reentry Task Force in the state of New York, and operates primarily in 2 New York prisons, the southernmost downstate prisons, Sing Sing and Fishkill. We're also now in Rikers Island. What do we do there? Well, we're inside and also help them when they come home and when they're in the community. Inside, we perform geriatric assessments, transitional planning for when they come home, and preparing for their parole hearings. Upon release, we celebrate them. Many don't have families or folks who are going to meet them when they come home. Through a Liberation Day, we meet them at the doors, drive them home, drive them back to, in many cases, most cases for us, to New York City, and provide care management for them when they come home. Employment training, medical services, in-home services. We hold their arm, we hold their hands as they try to navigate the world that has significantly changed since they last were home. What are the results? For long-termers, the ERA participants do better at the parole board. A 3-fold increase from 19% to 56% release rate for the older folks who participate in our ERI program and go in front of the board. Over 133 releases in the program's history, including Rikers. Only 3 returned to prison or jail, only 1 due to a new crime. Less than 2% recidivism rate, as opposed to the general population, that's a lot higher. They do come home, and like I said, a lot of them come home to the shelters. Half actually come home to the shelter. Now, in the age of Corona, that's not a very nice situation. There's a picture there of the close confines, chaotic, loud, violent, heavy policing, of course, through the parole and probation departments. Crowded, long waits, no privacy. I mean, it's just not the nicest situation. Housing is the #1 issue for folks who are coming home from prison after being away for so long. There need to be more supportive housing services, more supportive housing, beds and units. The city has, in the age of COVID, has taken upon themselves to use hotels for emergency. I mean, it's a really serious situation. And there's challenges for this group of folks who are coming home. One that we consistently hear about is the lack of identification, birth certificates, social security cards. They have to start a whole process of getting those documents together, and that can have a significant impact in enrolling for public benefits, including Medicaid and Medicare, and certainly for housing. Naturally, in many cases, lack of community and family, kind of left to themselves, the lack of work history, and a big one that probably should be up there, very and most important, is what we call frozen in a time bubble. If you've been away for 10, 15, 20 years, there was no smartphones, there was no Metro cards. It's a whole new world, transportation, how to get around, the internet. Training is inadequate inside and preparing them for when they come home. So it's somewhat intimidating dealing with the new world of technology. These are just some of the faces of the ERI participants on their Liberation Day, eating a good meal, a very good meal, I'm sure. And the lower left there is our program manager for the ERI program, Laura Roan, who meets them at the door and provides for them on those hectic and emotional moments. Stopping in a diner, stopping at a bank, taking them home. Justice across generations. We deal with the young, we deal with the older, and everybody else in between, through programming that includes family reunification, court advocacy when you first get arrested, diversion programs, alternatives to incarceration, drug abuse treatment, the lot. Children and families, though. And at this point, I want to take a minute to allow Zudi to come back on, and for the remaining portion of our time, talk about her experiences with a father who was incarcerated and the effects it had on her and her family. Zudi? Unmute yourself.
Hi. Now, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Just to talk about your experience as a child of an incarcerated parent and the effect on your family and community.
Okay, so when my father was incarcerated, I was 4 years old, and this was back in 1982. And my family is a very private family. And they didn't really tell me what was going on. It was kind of like they grabbed my father and they took him away from me. I didn't see him. I didn't know where he was at. And so from my experience visiting him the first time, it was like very scary. I'm a child. I've never seen walking into a visiting place. First of all, it was far away, very far away. I remember getting car sick. I remember my grandmother being very nervous, asking my grandfather for, money orders because he needed commissary. And I didn't know, that was very foreign to me. I didn't know what they were talking about. I was just a 4-year-old kid. But the reason why I can remember to this day those details is because it was traumatizing for me. And it was ingrained in my head. And adults usually, no, I'm not going to say usually. I think back then, children were supposed to be seen and not heard, kind of. So it was like, be quiet. We're taking over. You're just going to go on for the ride. You know what I mean? You're going to see your father. And, that's all I'm thinking. Yeah, I'm going to see my dad. So, we get on the bus and, there's a lot of other people there. And, not only are you in your own little world, but you're seeing what's going on with everyone else. You're hearing the drama, the stuff in the background. And then you're like, or you're thinking in your head is like, yes, I'm going to go see my father. I'm going to go see my dad. I haven't seen him in so long. Then you think about all of the things that you're going to say to him. And you think about, all of the things you're going to talk about. And then you think you're going to bring him home because you're too young to understand that he cannot walk out of there with you. So these are the things that are going on in my head. And so when we arrive, then you get the shock of, seeing like these, COs dressed up in bulletproof vests and how they have shotguns, and then there's these ferocious dogs. And then you get like the attitude, and you get like the authoritarian voice booming at you and talking to your sweet old little grandma like she's a criminal, and then all of a sudden I feel like I have this burden on me. I feel like just right then and there, I feel like I did something wrong. I feel like, wow, like what happened? Everything just shifts. And I feel like from that moment of seeing my father, my father figure, finally, when we get into the visiting room, waiting, it's like they tease you, you know, when you sit there and you wait for him, you know, it's like, well, you know, there you see these little figures popping up, these heads popping up in the window, and you're like, well, that's not my dad. That's not. Well, when is he gonna come out? And when they finally let him out, it's like they're playing with him. Like, wait, come here. Like they have to have like a little conversation with him real quick. I have no idea what that was about, but I guess maybe rules and regulations. Who knows? By the time he gets to me, I run up in his arms and I hug him and I kiss him. I have to share my father with everybody else in that visiting room, you know? And that whole thing is traumatizing for me because everything I had to say doesn't get said. So I'm stuck with all of, like, where are you? When are you coming home? Why are you here? So I'm muted. I'm basically shut down from my dad. And then walking out of there, seeing my grandmother break down and cry, and you know, and knowing that I can't walk out of there with my father was the most traumatizing experience that I could ever have. And going back never got easier. It was always worse because I was never told the truth. And so with this, I'm trying to say is that to me, this is like slavery, because what happens is that they take away your parent from you, and then it's like a domino effect. When they take away your father or your mother and they're locked up and they're in prison for so many years, and you feel like you're locked up, you feel like you did it. You feel like, well, that's my father and I come from him and I am him and he is me. You know what I mean? And everybody's telling you, shut up. You can't tell everybody your business. It's like an incarcerated person is someone who's undesirable. So the next door neighbor can't know your father's locked up. Like, you have to be quiet about that. You know, you can't go to school and when they're having show and tell, or when the fathers are coming, it's like, hey, you know, where's your dad? I can't say, well, he's Trenton State Prison, maximum security. Like, you know, I had to be quiet about that for so long that I literally, it's like a vomit now. It's like, I'm talking about it. I don't care. You know, we got to do something about this because our children are suffering because of this. Our children are literally shut down carrying this. And what happens is that they become defiant. They become defiant, or they become depressed, or they start doing things in society that I feel like is imposed on them. And then they get locked up. Or if they don't get locked up, then, you know, their friend gets locked up or killed, or they're selling drugs in the street, or they go to a gang because that's, you know, those are the streets love you. Come here. We're gonna put our arms around you. So, you know, just in a nutshell, that's my take on, you know, the whole situation.
And there's so many people around the country who I'm sure have experienced a similar kind of situation. There's so many people throughout all the communities in this country have left so much, and it has impacted so many. Was this experience that led you to the work at Osborne, Zulia? I know it led me to Osborne. I mean, I was incarcerated for 26 months, and I see the injustice in the system, and I was really excited about the opportunity to give back and to try to make change. Is it the same thing with you, Zulia?
Absolutely, it was the same for me. I always wanted to do something with a purpose, because if I was working a job that didn't have anything to do with, like, anything having to do with civil rights or humanitarian work, I felt like I was not living a purpose. I felt like these things were happening to me for a reason, and I didn't want to just let it happen to me. I wanted to do something about it. And you know, it really hit me more when I started to really, I say woke, when I woke, you know, up my third eye, when I woke up one day and I said to myself, wait a minute, it's not only my father, it's my son's father. Then it was my other son's father. And then it was like, now I'm giving the life that I tried not to give to my children. They have it, no matter what I did, no matter what education I got, no matter how cute I dressed up in the morning to go to work, no matter how politely I spoke, no matter how much I believed in God, and no matter how much I prayed, they were still incarcerating my family. they were still locking them up no matter what. And so I said, I have to do something more. I have to try more, you know? And it's like a fight that is never ending, but it's very rewarding at the end of the day when you see someone walk through the door who's just, I mean, he's saying, I just came out. I just got here. Can you help me? I'm like, can we help you? We can help you. You know, we can get you started here, you know? And I love to be able to speak to them and let them know, like, you know, give them that encouragement that, you know, that is your past. That doesn't define you. You have, you know, you have completed your debt to society. Now we're gonna work with you now. Now you're gonna be brand new again. So
well, we're glad you're working with us, Zudi, for sure. And I know it's being conscious of time. I mean, you've heard just a little bit of what we do and the directly impacted person that is Zudi. So to make sure that Andre has available time for the rest of the evening, we want to just kind of wrap it up and thank you again for allowing us the opportunity to speak in front of this group.
I want to thank you for listening. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you, but I just wanted to thank Zudi and thank Wendell so much for not only sharing, but for the work that you do day in and day out, for the commitment that you have, and for sharing the experience and the learning that you've gained, if you will, with us. And we look forward to, towards the end of the night, to speaking more with you and learning more from you through our Q&A. So thank you so much for taking that time. Andre, sir, I want to welcome you as we transition to Andre. I want to let everyone, our participants, know Andre Ward is the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, where he oversees Fortune's advocacy efforts to reduce reliance on incarceration, promote model programming for incarcerated people, change laws and policies that create barriers for successful reintegration, and foster a just and equitable criminal justice system, which is, I think, something we all know that we sorely need in this country. Mr. Ward is a social worker, a longtime advocate and activist for at-risk vulnerable populations who face barriers to employment and have criminal justice, chemical dependency, and/or mental health issues. Andre Ward serves as an adjunct professor at Medgar Evers College. In addition to being the author of the book, A Guide to Right Thinking for Reentry, a comprehensive study book for the presently and formerly incarcerated, he is certified as an anger management specialist and mental health first aid instructor. He's a motivational speaker, a life skills coach, and Mr. Ward was also a host for On the Count, the criminal and prison justice report that airs on 99.5 FM WAI Radio.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Tyrone, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. I mean, words are really inadequate to express the depth of gratitude the Fortune Society has to give a presentation to this group.
There you go.
Okay, got it. To give a presentation to this group, you know, when I heard the biography that was read, you know, I thought about all that I have gained as a result of organizations like Osborne, like Fortune, and the other organizations that really support people coming out of prison. And so, you know, I served 16 years of my life in prison. I was released on January 16, 2009. And for me, it was always important to localize myself within an organization that would support advancing and amplifying the issues people who have had justice involvement faced. And so my journey obviously started when I worked at Osborne, where Wendell, my dear colleague, Wendell works at now, and my other colleague who's on the call works at. I worked at Osborne for almost 6.5 years. And it's really interesting because the Osborne Association, much like the Fortune Society, is deeply committed to empowering people who have had justice involvement, and by an extension, really supporting them with living a life of contribution. So I'm really grateful to have been a part of the Osborne family and experience, and I still consider myself family there, even though Liz may not see me as much, but I have tremendous respect for the Osborne Association and the work that it does, and am now a part of the sister to the Osborne Association, the Fortune Society. So just a little bit of background. I know Wendell gave a powerful presentation, and certainly I think Zadaida, I think that's the correct pronunciation of her name. If it's not, I apologize. Obviously gave a really powerful testimony about the impact the criminal legal system has had on her family's life and hers. And the work that the Fortune Society does is born out of obviously this notion of being able to elevate people's stories and then change the systems that have impacted the lives of the people who told those stories. So I may not give a PowerPoint presentation necessarily. I know that you all have had that. I do have one available, may consult it, but I think I'll just speak directly from my personal observations and experiences, coupled with just being in the work now for about 11 years. And I'm still learning on this journey and course. So the Fortune Society has been around since 1967. And it started with the founder of the Fortune Society, David Rothenberg, having a vision to create a space for people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, particularly those who were in Attica prison at the time, to tell their stories. And you know, the reason why that I was late to this call is because we were actually honoring David Rothenberg for his birthday, which is today. And he has about 300 or so people that are on his webinar call as we speak, and just talking about his story and talking about the vision that he had for the Fortune Society. And through that vision of really telling people stories, at the time it was men in particular, because they had been overwhelmingly incarcerated like in 1967, 1968. And there was a huge outcry owing to the Attica Rebellion that happened in 1971. David Rothenberg wanted to tell that story. He had a deep roots in theater, and obviously had been all over the place and engaged with so many different actors and stars. And he felt that he could tell the stories of people through a play that he called Fortunes in Men's Eyes. And it was really an account and a testimony to the struggles that men who were incarcerated at the time in Attica had faced, and the need to change the conditions under which they were in to make sure that it didn't happen to others. And so in 1967, the Fortune Society was born. And we have since grown considerably. The Fortune Society has over 300 employees, has now approaching at least 50 some odd years of being in service to our communities and in service to people who have had justice involvement, with the goal of also changing systems, particularly the criminal legal system. And so we have 12 core areas that we focus on in terms of our direct service work. When we talk about it, and I'm sure Wendell in talking about what our sister agency does, which there's overlap and similarity, we offer support with education because people have educational needs. We support people to get access to employment opportunities because we know people having employment opportunities and a means of sustainable income ultimately moves people away from recidivating. We looked at ideas of supporting people to be able to access treatment services, right, for people who have substance use or chemical addictions in that way. And then we also look at mental health support, because we know that being incarcerated is obviously not only just an unnatural and abnormal environment, but it's an environment that produces trauma. So we obviously engage people through our mental health services. Then we knew that people needed support in accessing food to eat, because that too, it serves as a barrier sometimes to people being able to live a life of contribution and sustainability. If you don't have a bite to eat, you could resort to behaviors that can lead you back to incarceration. So we have our food services work and offerings that we have. And we serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner like our sister agency, the Osborne Association. And then we knew that we wanted to make sure that people who had been incarcerated and obviously would have opportunities to be able to come back to society earlier, we looked at engaging an alternative to incarceration work. And that's something that we obviously hold dear to the work that we do as well. And then there's central to our work is our housing piece. We, in 1997, started what is called our Castle Gardens and the Academy. So the Academy essentially is our emergency and transitional housing, where people who are coming out are able to access housing in an emergency situation and a supportive situation too, that they can transition into permanent housing. That permanent housing of which I'm speaking about is called Castle Gardens. And Castle Gardens is an admixture of people who have had justice involvement and residents who live in the community who are in this building. And they're connected together. And the reason why we call it the castle is because it looks like a castle. And it took a lot of work to build up community support to have people who've had justice involvement live in those places. And I'm sure many of you may have heard the term NIMBY, not in my backyard. Residents who lived in the community is like, why are you going to have people with justice involvement living in these spaces? And our CEO, Joanne Page, and our executive vice president, Stanley Richards, began a listening tour and a campaign to engage the residents that lived in the surrounding area to inform them that we and the people that will be residents here with their permission will not be a threat, but they will be people who will be assets to the community, and that housing them stably with the right supports in place will allow them to live a life where they don't return back to prison, they won't be a threat to public safety, and ultimately be someone that you can look at just like any other human being. And so through those kind of engagements, our housing work was established. We continue to maintain that housing work that's located in Harlem, the west side of Harlem. We also have housing for people who have been released from Rikers Island or from upstate that had some mental health, chemical addiction histories. We have what is called Freedom House that's also located in Harlem. And we do a lot of kind of work around supporting people in different ways. Different organizations look at the model of our housing work and ask for technical assistance, and we support in that way. So we serve around 8,000 people annually, which is a lot of people, most of which are people of color, Black and brown folk. And through those 12 kind of service areas, we are able to wrap around all of those that we serve in a way that they can access services in a one-stop shop kind of center. That center of which I'm speaking about is located in Long Island City, which is our main service center where the magic happens, right? Where these people who come in to our services who struggle in different ways are embraced in a way that supports and affirms their humanity and allows them to walk out the door feeling empowered. So our main service center is in Long Island City. One of the other pieces that's really important to the work of the Fortune Society is our advocacy work. And heading up our advocacy work at the Fortune Society is no easy feat, but it is one that obviously I'm really honored to be a part of, especially because I'm someone who has had justice involvement. And so in 2007, the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy was birthed as a response to the need for major criminal legal reform. When we look at the history of incarceration in this country and how that's really birthed mass incarceration, it goes back all the way to maybe like 1971. I'm just starting from that time frame rather than to maybe the late 1800s. But in 1971, following the Attica rebellions and that massacre that happened there, President Nixon was in office. And during that time of President Nixon's seat in office, you know, he had this mantra around declaring a war on drugs. Following that, obviously, were policies that were like set in motion to incarcerate more and more people. So after President Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs, what followed from that was Rockefeller laws, right, that criminalized small possessions of drugs and incarcerated more and more people of color. And then following that, you had in 1982, you had the Reagan era. And during that administration, right, Reagan had recommitted to what Nixon had amplified and like elevated, this idea of a war on drugs. And following that, right, again, you see the introduction in New York City and in parts of the country, right, this idea of crack cocaine was introduced into New York and by extension, the country. And following that, the introduction of crack cocaine into communities of color, mostly, but also nationally, we found that between 1988 and 1982, there was an upsurge, right, and a boom in incarceration. And following that boom, in the 90s, we saw even more people being incarcerated following policies like the 3 strikes and you're out policy, which meant that if you had 3 or more felonies, you would be automatically given a life sentence while incarcerated. So this history and the draconian policies that went throughout each of those kind of administrations has led to the need to be involved in serious reform work. So in 2007, the Fortune Society created the David Rothenberg Center as a means to engage those negative policies and to partner and collaborate with other organizations to be able to reverse and change those kind of negative policies. So in recent years, we've seen that, criminal justice reform has gained support across the political spectrum. But, those reforms that we're talking about usually really meant like small little tweaks to some of the current systems, like structures and practices. Like some sentences may have been like commuted, or some people may have been diverted from prison and released a little bit earlier, right? And some other people may have been provided some treatment services. But those were like small tweaks to the current policies and all of that kind of stuff. And it really didn't make a dent at all. Even though there is some support, it still hasn't made a dent in the overwhelming amount of people that are incarcerated. And it also doesn't address some of the more critical factors and issues associated with mass incarceration, namely addressing poverty, addressing violence, and the historical structural racism that has driven the towering criminal justice system. So Fortune, its approach to this criminal justice reform work, or criminal legal reform work, as you would frame it, that contains in it things like what my colleague Wendell had mentioned about language, right? All those things are part of our work. And there are 3 kind of ways that Fortune approaches the work of criminal justice reform and advocacy. We're either like leading something, we're co-leading it, or we're supporting something. And so some of the things that we have led on as an organization has to do with the employment accountability. When we look at employers, we know that historically people who have had criminal justice involvement have been denied access to employment opportunities solely on the basis of their criminal legal histories. And yet they are more than qualified for the role. So Fortune is really committed to holding employers accountable for actions of discrimination. And fairly recently, we were a part of a class action lawsuit with 6 other organizations to sue Target Corporation. And many of us know about Target, right? The Target store that some of us have frequented. We sued them in a class action lawsuit because they were discriminated against people with justice involvement to access employment opportunities. That's one kind of like way in which we hold employers accountable. Then we know, like Wendell may have mentioned earlier too, that people who have had justice involvement have been also historically discriminated against from accessing housing. And so Fortune, in a 5-year lawsuit pursuit won a settlement from a major developer in Far Rockaway because they denied and discriminated against people who were Fortune participants to access housing there. So we take leadership roles in that way, right? And those are some examples of that. And then because we know we don't do everything and we support others who do similar work, we may co-lead with some other organizations who have similar values or similar focus and a similar commitment to amplifying an issue and ultimately seeking to create legislation to change the negative impact of whatever that policy is as it relates to people who have been impacted by it. So we have recently, over the last few months or so, partnered with the Institute for Opportunities and Justice at the John Jay College in New York City, and others who are part of that, namely Osborne and others, to advance what is called fair chance housing legislation. And I don't know if Wendell mentioned it. If he did, I'll just reiterate a little bit of it. And so speaking to the point of people, again, being historically discriminated against from accessing housing and experiencing permanent exclusion from the New York City Housing Authority, the fair chance housing legislation is really designed to reverse those conditions totally, to remove the barriers of people having access to housing opportunities by getting rid of things like permanent exclusion from NYCHA, by making sure that people who may have committed offense on the grounds of the properties, right, unless it's maybe one or two major or serious offenses, are not denied access to housing. Making sure that people who are accessing or looking to access housing opportunities are not having their credits checked to access housing when they need it. Those things are really, really important. And so in collaboration and in partnership and in co-leadership with the Institute for Opportunities and Justice at John Jay College, we are seeking to advance legislation that would change those conditions that are currently in place of denying people and the policies that they have thereof, and ultimately creating opportunities for people to access housing opportunities. Wendell mentioned 50% or so of people that are released from incarceration are going straight to shelters. And under the current crises of COVID-19, it is making accessing housing even more inaccessible. And so we are pushing hard, again, and rallying and putting together webinars and speaking with elected officials to make sure that we are moving to change that condition. So the Fortune Society is partnering also with Assemblymember Advocacy to advance what is called the Shelter to Prison Pipeline legislation, which we are taking more of a leadership role in that, but also are open to partnering with other organizations to move that along, because that's important to us in our mission and our values. So that's leadership, that's co-leadership. And then we are very, very much supportive of different organizations, different coalitions that are looking to affect meaningful systems change, and more particularly, criminal legal reform change. So whether it be releasing aging in prison, RAP, who are looking to get people who are over the age of 55 released from prison, we support that. We support halt solitary confinement. And as it happens, our Executive Vice President, Stanley Richards, has been appointed by the mayor to be a part of and co-chair a working group to end solitary confinement. So we support halt solitary confinement legislation. We support less is more legislation, which looks to change the current parole technical violation conditions, because people who are under parole supervision are being violated for minor technical offenses like being late for curfew by 10 minutes, right? Maybe having a drink or two more than they should, or drink period. And rather than put them in jail, or rather than put them into a substance treatment center or something that can address their chemical dependency issue, they're putting people on jail. And so right now, there are more people, there are over 200 or something people or more that are on Rikers Island right now under the pandemic of COVID-19 who are on for technical parole violations. And so it insults logic and reason to really put people on Rikers Island under those circumstances, conditions, or any conditions at all, right, to be put there because you were late 5 minutes for your curfew. So we support less is more legislation. We also support this idea of like making sure that people are dealt with equitably and that Rikers Island closes, right? And so the idea of closing Rikers, that campaign, we have supported that, continue to support that. And so that's just like an overview of like the Fortune Society, an overview of some of our advocacy work. I know that we have been on this call for some time, and we welcome, obviously we're gonna be welcoming some questions that people have to ask. But that's just a general kind of overview of the Fortune Society. And again, we're looking to advance some other new kind of legislation because there's also been an upsurge in correctional officer brutality. And that's something that Fortune is looking to take the lead on and pushing to establish body cameras in the facilities so that it can reduce or even eliminate all forms of brutality and abuse in the prisons and the jails. So I thank you for taking this time out to listen to me. And I appreciate this opportunity on behalf of the Fortune Society to really be able to speak with you. And I welcome any questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andre. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Wendell. Thank you, Zedaida. Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom, your passion, and your work. I know that there are a ton of questions. There were the first few that came up in the chat were questions about sharing PowerPoint. So Wendell, the folks who are looking for the information that was in your PowerPoint, Andre, you mentioned that you had a PowerPoint, but you were going to sort of speak directly, you know, off the top and from the heart. But folks were asking if it would be possible to get the PowerPoint that you mentioned that they have not seen, just because there's a thirst for information. I know that other folks, and I have my team from One Spirit that have questions as well, but I think that many of the questions that we're seeing, folks are looking to figure out how to support, how to get involved, what are practical action steps that people who do not have your experience and expertise, what can we do to really be of service and make quantifiable, measurable impacts? So anyone, that's a question for any of you, the three of you, you know, to start, and then we'll sort of move from there.
And I'll defer to Wendell since he started. I'll defer to him and then I'll follow up with the response.
Thank you, Andre. But I'll also piggyback on what Andre said as it relates to partnerships. We have a very small policy team, as Andre knows, of 3 people. So we can't be everywhere for everything, Likewise. But there's so much going on. So, you know, looking at groups who are doing specific things, like as Andre mentioned, the folks from RAP, the release aging people in prison, meets every Wednesday evening, once the first Wednesday of every month, and has a membership drive. And they focus on, like the title of their organization says, to bring people home who really don't need to be in prison anymore. They have advanced stage, in many cases advanced health, and pose no public safety risk at all. There's actually legislation, I think Andre mentioned, that speaks to this issue, introduced by Senator Brad Hoylman and Assemblywoman, whose name escapes me, feels like it's Washington Heights. Who's that again?
Not Ayala. I mean, there's so many players in the political field. You can't remember all their names oftentimes.
Carmen De La Rosa.
That's exactly right. That's my mother-in-law's last name, right?
Who we love very much. But, you know, it has opposition from people, and it's a hard road to push, but it's pushed as far as it has ever pushed so far. But that's just an example of groups who are doing really powerful things. You mentioned the HALT group is working to end solitary confinement in New York State. My point is that to find organizations and groups who are doing things in areas of interest to you and to join their campaign. Osborne, obviously, we think is one of the leaders in the impact on children and families of those who are incarcerated, and the passage of this proximity bill through the legislature that awaits the governor's signature is something that can be really impactful for children to be able to stay in closer contact and more continued and frequent contact with their loved ones who are in many cases so far away. So to answer the question, I guess is ultimately just to identify the issues that most interest you and to team up with those organizations that are leading that effort, whether it's Close Rikers or in support of family and children of the incarcerated, or the elder parole issues in general, because as Andre said, the fastest growing number of people who are going into prisons in New York State, even though the number is considerably less, are people who are violating parole for technical reasons, which we just think is ridiculous. So partner with as many groups as possible who are like-minded in your thoughts and interests, and that will only help. We are strength in numbers, and politicians listen to people who are bringing thousands and thousands of voters with them.
Thank you.
I don't know if Zadaya wanted to go. I don't know if she wanted to say something. Zadaya.
Zudi? Just say Zudi.
Yeah.
Okay,
Usually,
Zudi.
you can call me Zudi, but my name is pronounced like Bronx Zoo and data entry. Zoo data, even though it's spelled a little bit more complicated.
I will not forget that. Zudata.
Yeah, you'll remember, yeah. But it's okay, you can call me Zudi. I agree. I believe that there's a lot of grassroots organizations out there that are tailor fit to fit everyone's needs. There's a lot of times where I'm like on Instagram or like I'm on Facebook and I'll like join one group. And then when I join one group, I'm like, wait a minute, that person is following this person or this organization. And I like what they have to say. So I believe it's like a domino effect that, like once it's like a networking, especially now since everything now is virtual and there's a lot of, Zoom meetings and Google Meets. And, I feel like that's like a nice way to get to know people and also to, find out what's going on, even like on your laptop or like on your, cell phone. You'd be surprised how much you can learn and how much you can get accomplished in just a few minutes just by doing a little research, Googling it or just Instagram or Facebook.
Yeah, and I support what my colleagues have just mentioned. I think it's critically important that people localize themselves within organizations that are doing this really, really important work and give of themselves in whatever way they can, right? I'm sure our folk on this call from One Spirit has expertise, the likes of which many organizations can benefit from in so many ways. So I would offer that people localize themselves in organizations and support in that way. The other thing I think is important and worth noting, and obviously Wendell would know this all too well, right? This pandemic has also caused budget austerity and a real fiscal crisis in the city and by extension, the nation. There's an organization that holds calls, I think once a week, called HSC. And the HSC is, I'm really bad with acronyms, I just had it in my head, but it's Human Service Council. And the Human Services Council really pulls together different nonprofit, many nonprofit service related organizations to give updates and strategize about ways in which people and organizations can know what's going on, be in action to making sure that they are supported in different ways. And I'm saying that in context to say that if you who are on this call have relationships with elected officials, if you are on this call are connected to people of influence that make decisions on how money is allocated, and obviously this goes to the executive of the state, Governor Cuomo, please appeal to them and let them know that nonprofit organizations need real support in making sure that they are receiving the funding needed to get these really, really critical services. Because right now, we don't know what's going to happen with the future of nonprofit organizations as it relates to the real serious budget cuts that are possibly looming and the budget austerity that we already face. So if nothing else, right, talk to other people. Like, say to them, if you're unable to just come into organization support in some way, that we have to make sure we stand with nonprofit organizations that are doing reentry service work to make sure they're getting the funding needed to support the people that need it the most. So that's what I would say.
Glad you mentioned that one issue on budget, Andre, because I think one of the most important budgetary issues, certainly for support for not-for-profit, but more specifically, the impending 40% thereabouts capital budget cuts from the city's budget for affordable housing, which specifically targets which will specifically target supportive housing and the kind of transitional housing work that Fortune leads on, and the permanent supportive housing needs that are so significant, as I mentioned before, because half the folks coming home from prison are going to the shelters, which is obviously exhausted, takes up more space, is using emergency housing in city hotels right now. It's just an ongoing and overflowing issue, and to have 40% capital budget cuts is a significant amount. It's just going to make the problem worse.
Well, I want to again say not only thank you, I want to open it up because I'm sure there are other questions. I want to let folks know, since we are recording this, we're also looking at some of the links that have been shared. Wendell has shared some links. Lynn has shared some links. We're going to be looking at compiling a list of resources for organizations that folks can get involved in with easy access links so that they can, do their own study and see. And I know that we'll, I can tell just by some of the looks in my colleagues' faces as I look around the screens that there's such excitement and enthusiasm at the possibility of making a real impact. So I'm sure that we will probably be reaching out to the three of you again for other opportunities to share your wisdom and keep the momentum going. Does anyone else in the remaining time, any one of our guests tonight, anyone from One Spirit in Action, do you have any questions for our panelists? I can see my co-founder and dear friend, Reverend Sonia Ketchian, has a question as a hand up. Sonia?
Thank you. I want to thank everybody again. This was an extraordinary evening. So my question was, you had mentioned, Andre, that you feed several thousand people every day in Long Island City at your facility over there. Is that manned by full-time employees, or are there volunteer opportunities?
Yeah, and I'm sure Wendell has obviously something to say as well, since as a sister organization, Osborne also offers meals. But, we serve 8,000 people annually, and obviously COVID-19 has kind of interrupted that since we've all gone to remote kind of work. But we do offer breakfast, lunch, and dinner to people that come through our doors now. We have taken some small steps consistent with the phases that the mayor and governor kind of like rolled out. They have some small footprint inside our Long Island Service Center. So I think, a way that people can get engaged, we have our volunteer services coordinator actually, right, who heads up the work of gathering volunteers and organizing, identifying people's skills and expertise to support the work. And I can get you that information to them. And obviously, because things are remote, there isn't a lot of footprint like happening inside of the facility, but it's something that people can reach out to. In fact, we had one volunteer, I'll give you an example of like just the amazing work that our volunteers do and the skills they bring. They had a background in doing editing and writing and all that kind of stuff. And they have been brought on to support the David Rothenberg Center with editorial work with our television program, Both Sides of the Bars, that's on 98 television stations in 26 states.
Wow.
Right? So that's one example. And then we have so many other volunteers that does that work. But I have the volunteer coordinator's information. If people are interested in that, I can connect people to that.
Great. Thank you so much.
We have the same kind of situation. We have a volunteer coordinator in-house, and we could always use the help. We usually take in the policy center an intern, fellow from John Jay, normally, every year, every semester, say, more than a year, more than one per year. And, you know, we can always use, from top to bottom, we can always use the help at Osborne, and the other coordinator that can handle that. So I can forward that information to your group and
Thank you.
let you guys know about that.
And just one thing to add to that, several of us from One Spirit were part of something called the Sisterhood Project recently, where we volunteered to support people, women that were formerly incarcerated, for a 10-week Zoom program where we spent an hour each week, essentially partnering different folks one-on-one. And it was an extraordinary opportunity to bring some of our training and our heart into supporting people. So I just wanted to throw that out. That could be something that One Spirit or One Spirit in Action may help facilitate if that's of any interest to either of you.
Yeah, I think, Reverend Sonia, that would be a great opportunity for us. David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, like our sister organization, Osborne, is a small crew, right? It's only about maybe 2 or 3 of us. And we look to, and to Wendell's point, right? We can't be everywhere. We would love to have arms like octopuses and like be able to like transport ourselves like Star Trek in different places at different times. But it's just incredibly difficult. So we do have folk who are a part of what Wendell mentioned, and the thought just escaped me, Wendell, when you talked about the person that you get like a fellow, right? So we do have a fellow as well, but we would be open to something like that because of what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, right? There was huge concern on the part of Fortune, and how do we engage our colleagues around that? What is Fortune's stance and voice in that issue around Black Lives Matter? And equally as important, how do we give our staff a space to heal from the traumatic experience of witnessing that? So we had partnered with someone who had conducted restorative healing circles with some of the folk who are part of what we call in the David Rothenberg Center, the Policy Center Collective, which is a group of Fortune staff who are interested in doing policy work. And so they are involved in like initiatives of connecting with, because we have funding earmarked to engage an outside entity like a school or something. They develop projects to work on. And I'm saying that in context that perhaps this webinar that you all have been given, and we can talk offline about it, could be something that could be offered to the Policy Center Collective first, which is maybe around 10, 12 staff, and then maybe offering it more broadly to Fortune.
Great. Yeah, something to talk about.
So I know, and you know, I know that there are more questions, of course, that I'm sure folks have. Unfortunately, we are at time here. It is about 8:30. I know that this is a part of America's original sin. It took 4 centuries to get us into this mess. And we know that we're not going to come up with the sort of silver bullet solutions in 90 minutes, but there's a commitment here from both heart and mind and body and will to be of service. That is what One Spirit is about. So we want to continue the work. I look forward to not only continuing conversation, but receiving emails, PowerPoints. I saw some links in the chat. Thank you very, very much, Wendell, as well for sharing that so that folks can get more involved. And as questions from our participants come up, we'll be sure, with your blessing, to get some of those questions to you, to our 3 panelists, so that we can continue to be of service. Again, this is just the 2nd installment of our work with One Spirit in Action. We have another date yet to be announced coming where we will be taking a deeper dive into the path from slavery to mass incarceration so that we can continue to deepen our education and our motivation to do this great work. I want to thank our busy panelists for taking time out of their lives and the amazing work they're doing to be with us, to share with us all this evening. I want to thank all of our attendees for coming, for your eagerness to hear, your eagerness to listen, and what I know and trust to be your eagerness to take action. So I want to wish you all a peaceful evening. Hopefully this has inspired you, and these will be things that we'll continue to work on and address together as a community. Thank you all so much. Again, I can't thank you enough.